Hey there everyone, and welcome to RPG Horror Stories with D&D Doge. In today's video, we have a tale about a group of adults playing Dungeons & Dragons that essentially bully a kid because he doesn't fully understand how to play the game. A story about a baffling first-time experience with D&D, and an update to one of yesterday's stories with an actual good ending. So, without further ado, let's get into these stories. 40-year-old OSR guys bully an actual child. By Reddit user, ThatWaterAmerican. When I was about 8 to 10 years old, my mom begged my dad to let me play D&D 3.5 with his regular group. I was never told how to play. They just gave me a rogue character sheet and sat me at the table. I was in way over my head, but I was having a good time, even though I didn't know what I was doing. What I didn't know until years later was that the other players said that I was ruining the game, and I don't blame them for that, to be honest, as I literally did not know what I was doing, and I'm sure that this story would be very different from their perspective. So I think it was the third session, where I got up to use the bathroom. When I came back, the DM said that my character had triggered a trap and died, so I asked if there was anything anyone could do. One of the characters cast Animate Dead on me, and my character rose up as a zombie that I was allowed to control. They said I had to follow their orders and that zombies can't talk. That meant that I couldn't do anything except roll dice in combat, and everyone laughed at me. As a child being bullied by 5 40-year-old men at a stranger's house, I started crying because I didn't even know how my character died, and obviously, I did not want him to be a zombie. My dad told me to calm down, and the other guy started teasing me, just being straight up mean. My dad sat there and stared at me as his friends called me names and made snarky remarks, which made me cry even more. That made my dad take me outside and tell me to calm down, or he would call my mom to pick me up. My zombified character survived 2 combat encounters and died during a big fight against kobolds. And the guys told me that there was nothing they could do because zombies can't be resurrected again. And so, I sat at the table for several hours, not being allowed to do anything but watch. After that session, I was not invited back, and to this day, my dad has never talked to me about it. I only found out how the other players felt from my mom over a decade later. I fully acknowledge that I was most likely annoying and ruining the game for these OSR guys, but I wish my dad had talked to me and taught me to play the game instead of finding a creative way to make it so that I couldn't speak and gave me a ticking clock before I was out of the game. Well, there is no beating around the bush here. OP's dad and his friends were definitely the a-holes in that instance. Could it be annoying to bring someone that young into a game that may be more adult-oriented? Sure, but you don't bully the poor kid. If anything, the DM could make a side quest for the kid to do while the adults took on the bigger bads. Or, and I know this may sound pretty out there, teach the damn kid how to play. Sure, OP would have had questions on things, and would have probably needed some guidance, but that is loads better than bullying the kid to tears, and probably turning him away from the hobby during his formative years. I can only imagine how much damage that did to OP's self-esteem. If anything, maybe not bring the kid to the adult game, and run a single-player quest at home with your kid, since they're showing interest in something that you have interest in. Nothing enrages me more than full-grown-ass adults that should know better than to bully a freaking kid over a game. Thankfully, it seems like OP eventually got into D&D, as they posted to a D&D forum. But I don't think they should harbor any thoughts that any of that was on them. Let's move on. My first time playing D&D. By Reddit user, Robin Stud. I've been playing D&D for about 10 years now, and it's definitely one of my favorite ways to hang out with my friends. I've made some amazing memories, and we've told stories together that have been fantastic, spectacular, audacious, romantic, heartfelt, inspirational, irrational, and well, you all know. When I look back through how it all began, I find it hard to believe I ever wanted to play a second time, or a third, or a fourth. The first time I played was at a friend's house when one of their friends I didn't know mentioned that he was a Magic the Gathering judge and a professional GM at one of our local game stores. I'd watched all the Acquisitions Incorporated a few times at this point and excitedly asked how I could get into a game. "Oh, we can play right now," he said. Amazing. I just met this professional GM and he's offering to start up a campaign for my friends and I right now. Of course, at that moment, I realized that we had no supplies, no books, no character sheets, no dice. Hell, we didn't even have pencils or paper. We were just a bunch of broke kids. "That's fine, we don't actually need any of that stuff," he said. "I'm a professional GM, so I can make it work." Looking back now, I realize what a colossal red flag this was, but back then, I just wanted to play some D&D. Besides, this guy was a professional. So there we were, the professional GM, a few of my friends, and myself, all sitting on the floor excited to play some D&D, when the GM says, "So, you all find yourselves standing in a field." Wait, what? We haven't talked about characters at all. I don't know what class I am, or even what my name is. How can we be starting like this? But the GM assured me that we could worry about all that later, and to just go along with it. We stood in the field for a few minutes before one of my friends, who played some D&D in 3.5, asked if we had backpacks, to which the GM said that indeed we did. The player asked if we had lanterns, to which the GM again said that we did. At that point, the player, frustrated by this whole process and tired of standing in a field with no guidance from the GM, says that he wants to use his lantern to light the field on fire. The GM tells us that the field is now ablaze, the fire is spreading quickly, and we have no way to put it out. So we run for our lives. The GM tells us that as we are running, we must make a saving throw, no stat attached because we didn't have character sheets. He rummages around his bag and pulls out a 20-sided Magic the Gathering countdown die to keep track of HP, and we each take a turn rolling it. I don't remember what we all got, but I do remember that the player who started the fire failed the save and ran into a lamppost in the middle of a field. What the hell is going on? We, the players, were so frustrated and surprised that we didn't understand. We began to revolt against the GM, and he told us that when we looked at the post, we saw that there was a tunnel underneath it that we could use to escape the flames. Fine. We go down the tunnel and find ourselves in a small enclosed room with white walls, and nothing inside except a rope hanging from the ceiling. Attached to the rope is a sign that reads, "Pull me." So I pull the rope. "Confetti rains down from the ceiling," says the professional GM, as you pull the rope and a hidden door opens, revealing a rope ladder leading up and out of the room. Fine. We exit the room and find ourselves on a rainbow bridge, surrounded by blackness that leads us to a floating island. The only thing on the island is a bush that is singing show tunes. Fine. I try to talk to the bush. Nothing. The player that started the fire tries to attack it. "You can't attack it," says the professional GM. We try to light it on fire. "It doesn't burn," he says. "It's a riddle. You have to solve the riddle." Eventually, we figured out that the bush wanted applause, and when we clapped at it, the GM told us that we were done for the night. Thank God. He said he knew it had been rough, but next time would be better. We saw him a few times after that, but he never offered to DM for us again, which is fine, because I would certainly have refused the offer. I was undaunted though. I'd seen Acquisitions Incorporated, so I knew D&D was fun. I just had to find the right people to play with. The player who started the fire in the field offered to DM next. Well, that certainly sounds like quite a first experience with D&D. That game certainly sounded goofy, and could have made for an entertaining comedic campaign. But the lack of character creation, stats, and everything else, it doesn't really seem like a good first-time introduction to D&D. I'm not really sure how much weight I would put into this GM's claim of being a professional. At least OP didn't let this deter him from playing any more games in the future. though the way OP ended the story gives off some ominous vibes. Let's move on, but before we do, I have to ask that if you're enjoying the video, that you consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. I'd like to see if we can get to 20k by the end of June, and if we can pull that off, I may do a special video or a stream or something. And since the internet runs on cats, here's a kitty to help you with your decision to click that subscribe button. And there you go. Now I think it's time we move on to the next one. The one where I turn an adult player into a raging child. By Reddit user CMDR Zabsky. A few years ago, a group of friends were running an ongoing 1st edition D&D game for fun, and it was ridiculous fun. We had a knight with awesome lines and flowery dialogue, a pygmy who always wore one of those huge tribal masks and spoke no common, and a pirate who had never been on a ship. You get the picture. Much alcohol was consumed during these sessions, and a couple of players were barely able to roll dice by the end of a good session, though they were not the problem. One of the characters was a cleric, played by a fairly normal guy, who was quiet, but still was a good laugh. Until this one night. Our party got ambushed in a forest by giant spiders, and the cleric was the focus of the attack. It was RNG, but 2 of them attacked him. As a rogue, my best shot was to try and shoot the spiders with my crossbow to save the party's only healer. Natural 1. The dungeon master, quite fairly, decided that I would have to roll to see if I hit the cleric instead, or if it was just a massive jam in the mechanism. But it turned out that I hit the cleric. He went ballistic. He blamed me for attacking his character, went red in the face, got shouty, angry, ragey, and sat in a silent sulk, barely even bothering to play for the next hour or so, as we finally took out the rest of the spiders. After that, he seemed to regain his composure, but there were many WTF glances exchanged between everyone else during the big sulk. Anyway, later that session, we came to a castle that we were supposed to get into. The plan was that I would use my skills to break in through a high-up window and let the rest of the party in through a sally port. As I'm about to start climbing the wall, the cleric decides to cast Curse on me, making me clumsy. Everybody turned to him with a very open WTF, and he just grinned and said, "Serves you right for shooting me." I just raised my eyebrows. I didn't want to cause any more of a scene, but some of the others caught him out on this weirdness, quite rightly saying that he'd basically crippled the party just to score a point, as we'd ascertained that the only way into the castle was using a rogue, because the rest of the characters were either not skilled enough or just outright clumsy. He just kept grinning to himself through all of this. It was so weird. I would never in a million years have guessed that this guy could act like such a sulky child. The whole group just felt slightly awkward in every other session after this, especially as he made a point of not talking to me during sessions, unless he absolutely had to. Fortunately, he moved away from the area shortly after this, and left the group. The childish meltdown of player name goes here is still spoken of in our group, even to this day. Now, I can understand being a tad miffed that happened to Cleric's character, but in the terms of the game, it was a legit accident on the OP's character's part. For Cleric's player to get upset with OP over this is not only an overreaction, but also misplaced. While I'm not a fan of crit fumbles that can harm other player characters, at least this DM allowed a chance of that not happening. But the dice fell where they did. To be mad at OP for this would be like getting in a car accident, where a car hits your car and pushes it into a truck, and the guy in the truck being mad at you for hitting him. Now, that alone is pretty childish, but to then hold on to a grudge and then risk the entire party to just get back at OP is infant-level petty. Though thankfully, the group didn't have to deal with this player long after that, by the sounds of it. let's move on. And this next one is actually an update from the last story of yesterday's video. So if you would like to check that one out first, I'll put a link to it in the description. But with that said, let's get into it. Update. Am I justified in being pissed for how my character died last night? By Reddit user boysenberrywide627. I'm really happy to say that our group talk went well, after all of us had time enough to cool down and consider each other's perspectives. We Skyped in, and I calmly laid out how the prior session had made me feel, helped by a lot of your comments, which articulated my feelings and arguments in a more concise way than I could have provided at the moment. Both my boyfriend/DM and the Paladin were incredibly receptive and listened to my grievances with a lot of understanding, with the Paladin even apologizing for his behavior and saying that he realized that he got caught up in the moment and failed to consider his fellow party members' feelings, and that he left the call initially because he wanted to cool down and not make the situation worse in the moment. I also owed the Paladin an apology for angrily calling him an idiot in the moment, which I provided and he accepted pretty gracefully. While we ultimately decided that a retcon/rewind back to the moment where the Draculich fell would be the best action in order to avoid any hard feelings, going forward, we've all collectively decided to utilize a time out and talk button if we feel things are starting to go south or one party member is beginning to cause issues in or out of game. Furthermore, my boyfriend stated that while he wanted to make sure that the campaign still had its moments of tenseness and stakes, and that there would inevitably be moments similar to this where party members could and would die, he would ensure that no party member was being unfairly punished or targeted, especially for another's actions. Everyone was really mature about the whole affair, and after laying out everything on the table, we agreed to pick up where we left off next Sunday and parted ways feeling a lot better. While it's not a particularly juicy ending, it is a satisfying one, and I'm glad that my friendship with the Paladin, or my relationship with my boyfriend, was not negatively affected by this going forward. I wanted to thank you all for the supportive comments and advice, as I think it made a difference in my phrasing of my frustrations, and kept the onus on solving the problem as a group, rather than lashing out. Well, would you look at that? Having a bad game and having frustrations with it being solved by sitting down and talking things out like adults. This proves that communication is one key factor in any successful game of Dungeons & Dragons, or any tabletop RPG for that matter. And I think a lot of the horror stories that I read here on the channel would turn out much better if they would just do what OP and her group did. Though I have to admit that there are a lot that wouldn't help. But it is good to see one of these stories have a happy ending once in a while, and I'm glad to hear that they all figured out how to move forward and use that event as a learning experience. But now, even though that update ended with some good vibes, let's finish off this week of stories with even more good vibes with this week's glory story. Hat of Vermin Saved Our Party by Reddit user Gray For You. Our party of 3, me, the sorcerer, fighter, and bard, were tasked with clearing an island of undead so that a lighthouse could be built to help ships navigate around the island's rocky waters. Said rocks tore our party to shreds before we even got to the island. We failed skill check after skill check to navigate our little rowboat through the rocks. We used spells and magical items for advantage and kept failing the checks. After we were all very well bloodied, we gave up. We anchored to a rock, mended the rowboat, and short rested. During the short rest, we noticed that the tide was going out and decided to wait another few hours for our boat to run aground. We ended up dragging our rowboat across the rocks and finally onto the beach. That's when the undead attacked. Swarms of skeletons rushed our party wave after wave. We fought them off, but our resources were running low. Out of the 3 of us, the bard was having the hardest time. His spells and abilities were all geared towards enemies that could think, so they were unaffected by fear, couldn't be charmed, and didn't understand the caster. The undead were immune to everything that we could throw at them. To add insult to injury, They passed 6 out of 6 saves against his vicious mockery. The fighter and I barely managed to carry the fight, using all of my spells and all of his abilities. When we thought it was over, the skeletons we had just defeated reformed into a skeletal juggernaut, and this thing hit hard. On its second attack, it knocked the fighter unconscious. The bard used his last spell slot to heal the fighter, and the fighter kept disengaging and setting up his sentinel polearm combo to keep the juggernaut at bay every round. If he failed one opportunity attack, it could spell the end for us, as he was the only one capable of dealing any real damage to it at this point. My sorcerer's Ray of Frost is hitting about half the time and dealing little damage. The bard tries Vicious Mockery a couple more times, and the juggernaut saves both times. But then, the bard has an idea. He reached into his hat of vermin and tries to hurl a rat at the juggernaut. These undead were tasked with killing all living things on the beach, so this could distract the juggernaut. The DM asked for a sleight of hand check to throw the fleeing rat, a check that the bard critically failed at, thus taking a bite from the rat before it dashed away. However, the DM rolled a d12 to determine the direction that the rat would flee in, and rolled 12 noon. The rat dashed right towards the juggernaut and ended up next to the fighter. That round, the juggernaut broke through the fighter's sentinel polearm defenses and was finally able to make another attack. So the DM flipped a coin to see if it would target the fighter or the rat, and it came up rat. The juggernaut critically struck the rat, dealing enough damage that it would have instantly killed the wounded fighter. But that was all the time that the fighter needed to disengage and reset his defense. The juggernaut was felled 5 rounds later, and we ended up giving the rat a burial at sea. It definitely seems like the party was on a one-way trip to TPK City there, though thankfully, that last-ditch effort worked out. Stories like these are why I love tabletop RPGs so much. Things could look dire, but thinking outside the box, no matter how slim the chances are, could be all that stands between your party and total decimation. And I agree that the rat certainly deserved the honorable burial at sea that it received. But that is all I have for you today. As always, I appreciate all of you. And now, a moment of silence for Rat. Until next time.